Good morning. Today's lecture is going to concentrate upon the antebellum era in the United States. When we say antebellum, we're talking about the years before the Civil War. So, what we're going to try and concentrate upon today would be from where we left off last time, which would have been with the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. We're going to go up to 1860, 61, and the focus is going to be upon how African Americans reacted, because so often I think we scholars and other individuals think African Americans did not fight back against the institution of slavery, but they did. So let's begin our journey. Um, when we say scholars, once again, we're talking about predominantly white scholars. Um, I think it's going to be years before African Americans will really get uh, into the profession and will begin to be able to write another or more extensive version of what happened to our ancestors. A lot of scholars argue that slavery was going to die out eventually, and they were like Thomas Jefferson. They felt it was going to die out, but they just weren't sure what was going to happen afterwards because they did not believe that free blacks and free whites could live together in the same environment. And we said that over and over and over again, and that also shows up in Thomas Jefferson's writing. If there was one invention that changed the scenario, it would be the cotton gin. And in life, you know, you cannot have one event. One event is always related to something else. And the cotton gin is important because you also have the Industrial Revolution that will begin to occur in Europe in the early 1800s. And with the Industrial Revolution, there's going to be more of a demand for raw materials, especially like cotton. And cotton was grown in the South before the 1800s. But I don't know how many of you have actually seen a cotton field. And to pick cotton is very difficult, tedious work, and your hands will just get cut up because the cotton bolls it's very prickly, and it would be like you were picking roses. You're going to get cut, and it was very slow. And what the cotton gin will do, it will speed up the process of in terms of picking the cotton, separating the seeds from the fiber, and will help to fulfill the demand uh, that was coming from Europe for cotton. And what you begin to see transpire then is that there will be like two Souths that will develop. There will be an upper South and the lower South. The upper South will be the places where uh, slavery had existed before, around the Revolution, and the lower South will be where slavery will come into being and will grow, especially up to the Civil War. And this is when you really begin to get that interstate slave trade. I'm not sure about uh, around Louisville where it was located, but in Lexington, the area downtown Lexington that used to be called Cheapside Park will be where the the slave auctions were located. And within the past year, Cheapside Park has been renamed after a black architect. And what I'm saying is, this is where, if all the horror stories that you read about selling African Americans and people, whites bidding on that, this will what will begin to occur, and you will have this movement. Then this movement of African Americans from the upper South to the lower South, and the driving force is going to be money. So the whites who were involved in slavery then will make money off of the institution of slavery. And it's not going to be just making the money off of selling cotton. This is when cotton becomes king. But it also will become off of, there will some people will make their living off of selling and breaking. And what I mean by breaking, trying to break the will of African Americans who were slaves. So this will be a very vicious process, very vicious process. And the nation never did decide how to deal with this issue of a nation that is supposed to be the Declaration of Independence, where individuals have inalienable rights, to a nation where you have people who are enslaved because of their skin complexion, and they are supposedly from a certain uh, racial or ethnic group. All right. Now, as I said in class, what you do, what a group of people do, and when I say a group of people, this is what we all do. And I'm not saying it's right or saying it's wrong. I think it's reality, and you can disagree with me on this. When you develop an action, when you do something, you have to develop a rationale as to why you did that action. And so, for the individuals who will be involved in the slave trade of African Americans, they're going to develop this image black people. And unfortunately, this image of black people that will develop will hang around. And now it has become somewhat ingrained in our society. Um, and what I'm talking about here is what Dr. Carter G. Woodson talks about in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, and what happens with education. And if you tell a group of people something over and over and over and over again, that group of people begin to believe it. So the people who will believe in slavery will begin to develop a rationale for why they have slavery. And quite well, they also will control the education system, and they will help to educate African Americans. And I know this is controversial, but a lot of African Americans will believe and buy into the system in terms of what they could or could not do. Right. So fortunately, there were African Americans who did resist. So let's talk about that resistance, because when I was growing up, and when I think back to the history books that I had, I don't think the process of me being able to educate myself really doesn't kick in until I go away to college. I was a reader, fortunately, before I went to college, because I guess being raised by myself, you know, and we didn't have all the audio-visual things that we now have in 2021. I did a lot of reading. And so I would read James Baldwin, and I would read Richard Wright, and I read The Invisible. Yes, I read those books. So, but a lot of African Americans did not do that. And the textbooks that they received had this one certain image. And as I said before, remember, winners write the book. You normally write the history to in a such a way to make your particular group look better. In other words, to support the idea of why you did what you did. Okay, so those many of the texts, even now, there are discussions even now going on in terms of how do you describe slavery, and I think Texas was one of those, that they don't really want to describe the horrors of slavery. Well, uh, there were horrors to slavery, and African Americans will resist. Now, if you're going to say, well, where were the slave revolts? The majority of African Americans did not participate in the slave revolts, but they could do little things every day to express their displeasure with the institution of slavery. And scholars now know that's where they would beat the animals. That's where they may destroy the crops. That may be where they did not work as fast as they could work. There also, we now know, their records, their incidents of where African Americans will poison, when gotten the chance, they will poison their master or their mistress. Uh, so that will be resistance. And that goes against the Southern image. The Southern image was that African Americans were happy go lucky, childlike creatures. You might have heard of the term Sambo. Okay? That is what was the poem by Claude McKay? We who wear the mask, we who wear the mask, African Americans then who were enslaved would understand for their safety, they would put on a certain image, but when they got the opportunity, they would be themselves. It was a mask that they would wear, and that the slave owners would only see what they wanted them to see. So do not ever underestimate people who we may think do not have education. I want you to think about the value, or think about the importance of the spirituals for African Americans, and helping, and how they were used by African Americans to help them to escape. Uh, think about how African Americans will serve as spies, especially in the Civil War, to help the Union Army. So please don't think that because you do not find a lot of slavery votes that African Americans uh, accepted slavery, because that is not true. Let me give you some examples. In the Revolutionary Era, there was the Amistad. The Amistad, and there is a movie. This was a ship, and this will be where the African Americans, not that we're really Africans, Africans will be able to uh, capture the ship from the slave owners who were bringing them to the New World to put them into slavery. And ironically, one of the lawyer who will defend the Africans who will overtake the Amistad will be John Adams, who will be the second president of the United States. Um, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the possible slave revolts, and I say possible slave revolts because there were the ones in 1800, and there was one in 1822, and the one in 1800 with Gabriel Prosser in Richmond, and the one in 1822 would be Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, and they did not become fruition because there will always be that one slave. A term your generation uses is snitch, who would snitch to white, and that kept those two possible slavery votes from occurring. Don't forget, uh, in Haiti, in Haiti, the Africans or the Haitians who were of African descent were able to defeat Napoleon's army, and Haiti will have a successful slave revolt, and Haiti will become an independent nation of just basically, you want to say, black people, and that put fear into the hearts of slave owners. So it's interesting. On one hand, slave owners were arguing that slaves were sambo, they were childlike creatures, but yet on the other hand, they knew that they were humans and they wanted freedom. Okay? 1831, 1831 in Southampton, Virginia. Southampton, Virginia would be near Norfolk, down in that area. It's the Tidewater area. There was a man by the name of Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a free Negro uh, who believed that he was receiving signs from God to lead a successful slave revolt, or to lead a revolt against the institution of slavery. If I'm not mistaken, Nat Turner also was a preacher. Um, and something else that Nat Turner did do, he also made sure with his plans that there were some slaves that he did not mention this to. He did not tell them about what he planned to do. But the bottom line is that in 1831, Nat Turner will lead a rebellion, and it will start on the plantation where he he started one plantation and he went to move from plantation to plantation throughout Southampton, uh, Virginia, Southampton County, and the final total was over 60 whites were killed by Turner and the slaves who will uh, participate in the slave revolt with him. Now he will be eventually captured, and of course will be executed. But my point is that then you do have rebellions, open rebellions against the institution of slavery. So names you need to remember: Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner. Okay, don't forget Haiti and the revolution in Haiti. There's also, of course, William Box Brown, and I love the story of William Box Brown, uh, who came up with this idea that he was going to have himself transported from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I read, I think the trip normally by stagecoach was about 26, 27 hours. He was put inside a box. And for that entire trip, then, he was not going to eat. I'm not sure he was going to be able to sleep. This is where he would take care of his restroom. He wouldn't be able to drink. And he couldn't make any noise because if he made noise, that would alert someone that there was someone inside the box. And he will be transported from Richmond to Philadelphia. That will be, and that is going to be how he was gain his freedom. So that's the reason he is called William Box Brown. I want you to think about how innovative that was. Of course, when we talk about runaways, then we always have to put it top of the list. Harriet Tubman, okay, the Black Moses. Uh, I'll let you do some reading about her, but I was somewhat surprised that in, that her husband was not one of the people that she helped to escape because for some reason he did not. Now, whether he did not want to, I'm not sure, but Harriet Tubman was very successful with this. She made it very clear. The story, she made it very clear that if anyone started, let's say you started with, she had worked out the arrangements for escapes for slaves to escape. They had started the trip, and let's say someone all of a sudden got nervous and decided they were going to turn around and go back. Well, she made it very clear that she was going to shoot them and kill them because if they're dead, they can't tell anything about the plans. So once a person started, they were with Harriet Tubman for the entire journey, whether it ended being captured or if it ended with freedom. So she was never captured. And during the Civil War, Harriet Tubman was a spy for the Union Army. So during the Civil War, then she went back to the South and was working for whites and transmitting information to the Union forces during the Civil War. So you think about, you want to say she definitely was raped. Some would say she definitely had God on her side. But all the trips she made from the South to the North, all the trips she had to make back to the South to get more people to freedom, and during the Civil War, she was a spy. So that's the reason she has earned the title of being the Black Moses. And hopefully her face will be on the $20 bill. Hopefully the Biden administration will go through with those plans. Um, in addition to her, and I'm just going over some of the names, and you can hopefully go do your own research. There were other abolitionists who you would have to say were more peaceful. And what I mean more peaceful, they tried to change the system legally. One of the white abolitionists who was the most well known, and there will be whites who will be abolitionists, who will be participate in trying to end slavery. But one thing I want you to also remember and I'm going to say this, just because a person was against slavery, just because a person wanted to end slavery, did not mean that that person believed that blacks and whites were equal. I'm going to say this again. Just because a person wanted to end slavery, and that would say white, that did not mean that they were against, that they believed in equality. Okay? Uh, some people were against whites, were against slavery because they felt it made white people lazy. Uh, some people were against slavery because they felt that it was taking, the slaves were taking jobs away from whites. So just because someone was against slavery does not mean that they believed in equality. And also the other thing, um, and I'll say this, and this is maybe more American history. The issue was not whether slavery was not right or wrong for a lot of politicians and a lot of white Americans. The issue was whether or not slavery should be allowed to expand. The Republican Party that Abraham Lincoln was a member of did not believe in slavery was right or wrong. They believed that where slavery existed, slavery should be allowed to stay. It just should not expand. And that's very different from arguing slavery is right or it's wrong. They would say, okay, Alabama has slavery, Mississippi has slavery, Georgia has slavery, but we don't want Nebraska to have slavery. That's a very different argument, and that we don't talk about when it comes to dealing with the Civil War and why the Civil War and so forth occurred. Okay, um, so that's William Lloyd Garrison will probably be the most well-known white abolitionist, as I said before, and he will also start a newspaper that will be an anti-slavery newspaper. But when it comes to the most well-known black abolitionist, there's no doubt it would be Frederick Douglass. Um, Douglass will be an individual who escaped from slavery. His autobiography is still used in college classes, many college classes across this country, even now. The Lives and the Times of Frederick Douglass. It talks about his life. It talks about him learning to read. One of the mistresses of a slave owner taught him how to read. It taught him. It 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 also in the book it talks about Douglass standing up to a slave owner who tried to beat him, and of course it deals with his escape. And since he did escape to the north, and there will be a bounty on his head, that eventually he had to go to, I think, to England to live because of what we talked about before, the fugitive slave law. He will come back to the United States. I think uh, somehow some people took up money to pay whatever the slave owner wanted for him in terms of price, and he will be the most well known. Not just black abolitionist, most well-known abolitionist, and you're going to read his speech, but also during the Civil War. The Civil War, he was one of the most influential African Americans in terms of dealing with Abraham Lincoln and making it very clear to Abraham Lincoln that African Americans should be allowed to fight in the Civil War, and we'll talk about that in another lecture. And his son will join the Union Army. And after the Civil War, uh, Douglass will still be a leader and active in Reconstruction. He began to lose a little influence with African Americans in the latter part of his life because his second wife was white. Um, so I think well, that's somewhat interesting. But no matter considering how much he did and how much he gave uh, for the freedom and the equality of African Americans, that some people turned against him because of who he loved. Um, Now, with Frederick Douglass, then I would say if there's such a thing as a leader of black people, then Frederick Douglass would have to definitely be the first one. And I think the year he died is going to be the year that Booker T. Washington is going to give his famous speech, the Atlanta Compromise, which you will read later. So it's like if you're going to say who was the leader of black people, it would definitely have been Frederick Douglass, and he rose from being a slave to where to becoming an escaped slave to where he became a counselor, an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And what's interesting, I've also read that once or twice Abraham Lincoln threw him out of the White House because uh, he did not miss words in terms of what he believed. Other individuals that would be interesting for you to remember is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth. And if you do a little research about Sojourner Truth, you want to look for her poem entitled Ain't I a Woman? Ain't I a Woman? And because when we talk about women's suffrage in this country, the focus has always been upon white women. And Sojourner Truth was saying, look, when you talk about women's suffrage, you're also, and suffrage means women having the right to vote. When you're talking about women's suffrage and women's right, I am a woman. Ain't I a woman? So you need to go read that short poem. It's very powerful. That's another example. There's Robert Smalls. And I know Robert Smalls, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but Robert Smalls will be a slave who, during the American Civil War, he will be able to escape from slavery. And how he escaped from slavery is that he worked. Uh, he worked for the Confederate Navy and in South Carolina. That's where his family lived. That, as I stated, they were slaves. And you know what he did? He was able to pilot a ship named the Planter from the Confederate lines to the Union lines. And he had watched the white person who was, I guess, the captain of the ship. He knew all the secret signals. He knew how the man dressed. And one particular night, he had put his plan into place that was used to help his family and some others to take the ship called the Planter from Confederate lines to Union lines. And I think that's once again, think about it. What he had to do to pull that off. But that is an example of of an African American who let people know he didn't want to be a slave. And we don't talk about that in American history. So look up Robert Smalls. The other one is Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey will be eventually uh, become a free Negro. But the reason I want you to mention Paul Cuffey is he was one of those who believed in immigration, and immigration would be African Americans living somewhere else, another nation. And he did not work with the American Colonization Society uh, to settle in Liberia. He worked with the British, and he will help the British take some of the ancestors or the descendants of African Americans who have fought with the British in the American Revolution. He will help them go to Liberia, not Liberia, sorry, to Sierra Leone, Sierra Leone, to Sierra Leone. And so Paul Coffey then is someone that you need to know about. As I was doing some research for this lecture, also there were African Americans, especially in the North, where you had what we would call free Negroes who were focusing upon education. And I think, especially since Simmons College of Kentucky is an HBCU, you need to know about the first three what we would now call HBCUs. They wouldn't call themselves HBCUs, but we would call them HBCUs. The first one was in 1837, which would be Cheney State uh, in Cheney, Pennsylvania. Now, it would be Cheney State was not a college. In fact, it will not be able to offer college degrees, I think, until 1914. But Cheney State began to offer an education to African Americans. Remember, public schools did not exist. There's no such thing as K through 12. So Cheney State will be open to help African Americans, free people of color, free Negroes, uh, get an education, in which I have to say will be the basic education. It might have been to teach skills or to teach trade, but the first HBCU would be Cheney State. The second one would be Lincoln University, and Lincoln University also in Pennsylvania. And Lincoln will open in 1854. Um, and I think Lincoln will be the first uh, HBCU to offer college degrees. Um, Now, I think I'm not sure why, but it's interesting that both schools were in Pennsylvania, and it may have been because of the influence of the Quakers. Quakers, Pennsylvania was settled by Quakers, and Quakers tended to be against the institution of slavery, and they did put a focus upon education. All right. And the third school that you need to remember, because I have a friend who works there and who's the executive vice president, make sure I always know this, is Wilberforce University. Wilberforce University in Xenia, Ohio. And Wilberforce will be the first uh, institution which was owned and operated by African Americans. Notice I said owned and operated by African Americans. Cheney State was started by whites and was run by whites. Uh, Lincoln was started by whites and owned by whites, and started by whites, operated by whites. Wilberforce was started by blacks and operated by blacks. And Wilberforce is, which still exists, is an institution that was started by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church that I've talked about before. Um, in terms of very quickly, what else I would tell you about slavery? Remember, not all whites own slaves. We think only about 10% own slaves. Uh, the typical slave was on a farm or plantation of less than 10. It's in the South where you see these big, huge plantations. Like any group of people with African Americans, there will be classes. Classes, what I mean by class, or some people would say castes, would be divisions. There will be those who will be field hands, who will work in the fields. They tended to, a lot of times, it would go by your complexion. If you were dark skinned, you would be in the fields, working in the cotton fields, especially in the black belt. And the black belt is, if you would go to the deep south and go to Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, you can see it. You can see it when you visit those areas, and you notice that the number of African Americans that you will see, it still exists. That would be where cotton was king. Or also in Louisiana. Now, Louisiana is going to be a little bit different because of, you have Cajuns and Creoles, and that would be where there were more interracial or more miscegenation there. And so I think Louisiana may be based upon more of a complexion than the other slavery in the other states. But the bottom line is this: tends to be field hands were darker skinned, house Negroes or house servants were tended to be lighter skinned. Quite often, many of them will be descendants of relationships, sexual relationships between a slave woman and the master, or anyone white. For example, with Booker T. Washington, we know that his mother was a slave, and Booker T. Washington's father was a white man from another plantation in Bedford, Virginia, where he grew up and where he lived. So, and then there's a third category we don't talk about, and that's the one called the driver. And on larger plantations, you would have, in many cases, the master and the mistress did not live on that plantation. You would have an overseer who would quite often be white, and in many cases, that person was brutal. They were brutal. So let's not call slavery as this love fest, and our people love to say slavery was not as bad in Kentucky. That is a bunch of BS. Okay, because any slave owner, any overseer, anyone white had the right to do whatever they wanted to. They also controlled the justice system. Remember, the United States is a nation of law, and law does not the same thing as justice. Now, on many plantations, you will have the person who was called the driver, a slave driver. And the slave driver would be similar to what a foreman was. Okay? And that would be your head, can I say head Negro? Okay, now some of you may say the N word a little bit different, but that would be that person who would, in the position they were in, they would be the ones that would help to make sure that the rest of the black folks did what they were supposed to do. So on the larger plantations, then, you would have the master and the mistress. You would have the overseer, but you would also have the slave driver. And that would be like the foreman. And in many cases, that foreman, that driver was more brutal than the whites, because once they had gotten a position, they wanted to make sure that they maintained that position. All right. And also, another area we don't talk about is the free Negroes, the free people of color. And I'm saying it that way because in the literature, if you do historical literature, you'll see those different terms used, and it's talking about the same group of people, especially in the North. Now, even in the South, there will be free Negroes. Okay. And that would be, they would be technically and legally free, but it will be very precarious because states will pass laws that will say if they gain their freedom, they were supposed to leave the state within a certain period of time. And why did they do that? Because Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, slavery votes were tended to be led by free people of color. It's almost like they had reached some status that they were free in many ways, but they wanted to be free in all ways. And they were the ones that were the most restless. And slave owners knew that. So slave owners will try to limit the number of African Americans who could gain their freedom. And you could gain your freedom sometimes by doing something that the master or the mistress really loved, maybe saving their lives, or you had a trade or a skill where you could buy. There will be some black people who were able to buy their own freedom because they had a skill and their master allowed them to work and to make money and to pay and to buy their freedom. Uh, it could have been that some of them gained their freedom because they had participated in some of the different wars, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, uh, that and one of the by doing that they had been able to gain their freedom. Um, so there are different ways that it could occur. Or, let me add this: sometimes that slave owner had a change of heart and had decided slavery was wrong. And some slave owners also will free the slaves, but they will require them to go to Liberia or to go to Sierra Leone to live. There are different reasons. But I want you to understand there will always be free people of color, and especially in the North. There were some in the South, and if you go look at the census returns, you will see their names, their ages, their genders. There will also exist in the North, but where Southerners had slavery, Northerners will have segregation. Southerners had slavery, Northerners will have segregation. Segregation will exist in the North. Places like Philadelphia and even New York City, uh, some of the rural areas. Just because they were free did not mean that African Americans were treated as citizens. And in fact, uh, one final point before we go, a Supreme Court decision I want all of you to remember. Yes, people talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. Yes, people talk about Brown versus Board of Education. But you also need to talk about the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court of the United States will say it did not make any difference if a black person was free or if they were slaves. They did not have any rights that had to be respected by a white person because they were not citizens of the United States. The Supreme Court said that in 1857 in Brown versus, not Brown, excuse me, in the Dred Scott decision, African Americans, be they slave or free, were not citizens of this country. So when you think about then an African American who was in the North, who was supposedly free, that's how precarious it was. And as we were stating the other day in class, remember, many of the African Americans who were free, remember, it is based upon their skin complexion. They were able to pass. Now, legally, they were still black. Legally, they were still black. Because most states, not most states, some states still had, if anybody in your family tree was African, you were black. It didn't make any difference how far back you went. And I know some people want to go back and talk about Adam and Eve. They didn't go that far. All right, so let's be realistic. Some people would say, let's go back to a grandparent, okay, your great grandparent. That would determine your status. So you can have one great grandparent who is black, and everybody else could be white. That meant legally you were black. So it varied from state to state. And what I'm saying is that some people pass. And if you were passing, that meant you knew that there was somebody black in your family tree, but you were going to live your life as white. Were your features were in terms of your hair, your complexion, you look white. You may have I'll throw this out there anyway. Some people would say you sound white, you talk white. We'll talk about that in class because I know some of you disagree with that. But the bottom line is that with if you were a free person of color and you lived in the North, you were always worried that somebody might find out something about your family tree. All right. And when that happened, then, well, your life would be over. So that's it. When we talk about what it was like for African Americans during the Antebellum era, the majority were slaves. Uh, and there's no such thing for me to say, there's no such thing as slavery was not as bad in Kentucky as it was somewhere else. A slave was a slave was a slave, which meant that your rights as a human being did not exist. And even if when slavery did not exist, even in the North, African Americans were treated as second class citizens because, as I said, one area had slavery, another area had segregation. And what I'm trying to get you to understand is what our ancestors went through, what they went through for African Americans to be where we are in 2021. And that is one, we talked about resistance, but we also have to talk about the importance of the black church. The importance of the black church. Some I know are going to be cynical and talk about pie in the sky, but that faith is what allowed African Americans to survive and to continue to believe And I guess you could say continue to believe, and because of their belief and they're willing to survive and they're willing to sacrifice, we can still be at Simmons College in 2021. All right. I hope you learned something, and I hope I said something will motivate you to do research, because just remember, there is no way in 15 or 16 weeks that I'm going to mention every topic, cover everything about African American history, but hopefully I can say enough to get you interested to do some more research. Okay? Take care. Bye.